and the moderator.
Great. My name is Tim Wutine. I work with Jenya in the YPE San Francisco chapter. And I'd like to first introduce Lydia Lee from Generate Capital. Lydia will be our moderator. So can you just give us a brief overview of your role at GC?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Lydia. I'm an investor at Generate. Generate is a company that finances, builds, owns, and operates sustainable infrastructure projects. We are broadly active in 3 large verticals: power, transportation, waste, and water. Within power, we invest in solar, battery storage, microgrids, and fuel cells. Within transportation, we broadly invest in any zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure that allows us to deploy those. And in waste and water, we cover organic waste, inorganic, landfill, waste-to-value projects, sustainable materials, and wastewater management. Generate is structured as a company. We're not a typical investment fund, which allows us to be the true patient capital behind the scaling commercialization of new technologies in the sustainability space. At Generate, I'm currently focused on the transportation sector, which also includes hydrogen up and downstream production and use of hydrogen, particularly focused on hydrogen, the role that it's playing in transportation. I'm very honored to be the moderator today, helping you understanding what's going on in this sector, and happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Lydia. We're really happy to have you moderating today. Next, I will kick it to Don, who's the Director of Market Strategy and Analysis at Plug Power. Don, can you give a brief overview of your role, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Don. I've been with Plug Power about 10 years, where I head up our market strategy and analytics efforts. So I help the company figure out where we should grow our business, what industries, what applications, what segments of the world, what time frame should we get into these businesses? Is it the next 2 years? Is it in 5 or 10 years? Setting price targets, cost targets for our technologies. And for those of you who don't know, Plug Power is the world leading green hydrogen solutions company. We got started as a fuel cell R&D company and have transitioned into hydrogen solutions. So we're an international company forming joint ventures with Renault to make light commercial vehicles in Europe. We're forming a joint venture with the SK Group to bring the hydrogen ecosystem to South Korea. And we're the leading fuel cell and MEA manufacturer here in North America and the world's largest consumer of liquid hydrogen for private fleets such as Walmart, Amazon, Home Depot, BMW, Mercedes, and all those companies that have very large forklift truck fleets. Happy to be here with you and talking about hydrogen for mobility and other applications.
Thank you, Don. Yeah, we're really lucky to have you. Next, we will kick it to Andrew, who's GC and head of policy at BayoTech, and also a host on the Everything About Hydrogen podcast.
Thanks a lot, Tim, and really happy to be here, guys. As Tim said, my name is Andrew Leadham. I am the general counsel and head of policy at BayoTech. BayoTech is a New Mexico-based modular on-site hydrogen generation company. At least that's how we started. We have recently acquired a hydrogen distribution storage, IGX Group Inc. And through that acquisition, we've become a vertically integrated hydrogen solution provider, right? So when it comes to the transportation sector, which is our priority market at the moment, we can either deliver to the end user directly, or we can build a dispensing station on site, and we can provide the hydrogen and the molecules at the dispensing site. Conversely, for the larger operators who want to have actual generation on site, we can drop one of our reformers on a skid at their location or at a hydrogen dispensing fuel station. So that's kind of our value proposition, and that's what we do.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And last but not least, we have Val, who is the founder and CEO of ZeroAvia. Could you give a brief overview of your role?
Sure. Hey everybody, this is Val Miftakov. My previous company is now NLX e-mobility. So that was a great experience. That's a company I started before ZeroAvia to work in the sustainability sector for zero emission transportation on the ground. And since then, that company was acquired, and I spent a couple of years there, and then moved on to run my next company full time. So this is ZeroAvia. And what we do here is we're building the what we call world's first practical zero emission aviation powertrain. So we're working on the series of engine platforms that will repower all types of aircraft, commercial aircraft and aviation. We started the company back in 2017, and then 2018 we've done a lot of ground testing. 2019 first flights, 2020 additional flight testing campaigns, and so far we're able to get to the leadership position in the zero emission aviation, and we think hydrogen is going to be the answer there.
Great, thanks so much, Val. Well, I think we're primed for a great discussion, and I'll kick it to Lydia to start that. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I prepared a couple slides just to help us stage set and go through some terminology so we are all really understanding what we're talking about here today. This is not meant to be digging into any specific topic, just to set the stage. May, do you mind flipping to the next? Quick introduction of Generate. We specialize helping developers and technology vendors in building sustainable infrastructure in the 4 Ds, as we categorize our assets. They're decentralized, democratized, digitized, and decarbonized. For the sustainable mobility space specifically, highlighted on the page, we have invested and will be investing actively in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and fleets, as well as hydrogen refueling infrastructure and up and downstream of production of hydrogen. Next slide, please. Yeah, so why is hydrogen so important and why are we talking about today? Hydrogen can serve as a unique tie between the power grid and the gas grid. The 2 grids today are relatively distinct, and it's very hard to use any intermediary between the 2. And as we move towards a more decarbonized economy, hydrogen is going to be a zero carbon resource for not just the power generation, but also replacing some of the raw materials used in green chemical and other industrial processes, as well as serving as a clean fuel for transportation. So all of these different links on this page shows that the ways of hydrogen being produced versus the ways of hydrogen being used today. And next slide, please. On this slide, we can see more clearly, as of today, this is in 2019, based on IEA data, most of the hydrogen is produced from fossil fuel sources. The most common process that we use to produce hydrogen is called SMR, steam methane reformation, that is converting natural gas into hydrogen. This is the purple or violet part of this slide. Most of the hydrogen used today are in oil refining, ammonia, and other chemical productions, some in heating or building applications, and very little of hydrogen used today in transportation. But that's one subsector that it's really projected to be growing in the next 10 to 20 years because of our push for zero emission vehicles. Next slide. I think many of you have heard about different colors of hydrogen. Just to help us understand or getting on the same page today for our conversations, what does it really mean to have a color for the hydrogen? Hydrogen is, there's no color, it is transparent, you won't see it. But gray hydrogen, as we call it, refers to hydrogen produced from fossil fuels. So most of the sources we saw on the last page, that's gray hydrogen. Blue hydrogen typically refers to a gray hydrogen production process coupled with carbon capture. So the net impact of producing that hydrogen is mitigated by the carbon capturing. And green hydrogen refers to a process by itself without carbon capturing. There's no carbon emission. So the most common way of producing green hydrogen today will be using renewable energy sources like solar or wind or hydro to drive electrolyzers and converting water into hydrogen. There are obviously other ways that we consider green hydrogen is produced through, for example, renewable natural gas that's from either food waste, landfill waste, or other mitigating, carbon mitigating channels. But the fundamental way of doing green hydrogen is through electrolysis. Next slide. This is a quick chart showing the process of using clean energy sources, as I mentioned, wind, solar, hydro, converting water through electrolysis into hydrogen gas. In here, the little gas tank, and the hydrogen can be used through a fuel cell, either in a mobility application some type of vehicle like Plug is doing, or it can also be a stationary fuel cell where we generate electricity for the grid. Next slide. So why is hydrogen so important? The overall total addressable market for hydrogen economy is huge. A lot of this may or may not exist today, especially what the subsector that we're focused on today, transportation. In the second row where the orange bubbles are, hydrogen used in transportation today is relatively limited to smaller vehicles and less on-road, more commercial vehicles like forklifts. But in the future, we see the potential application of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, both for heavy-duty vehicles on road and shipping, as well as aviation. So that's an area where the growth is potentially going to be. In addition to transportation, we're also seeing green hydrogen playing a very important role to try to decarbonize other industrial applications that are considered dirty and heavy today, where it's hard to really replace the actual source of carbon emission in those processes. Using hydrogen as a clean raw material will really help decrease the carbon footprint for these processes as well. Next slide. So a lot of people ask me, hey, is hydrogen actually a new sector? Does it mean that there aren't really many companies doing it? Are all the companies today startups in early stage? The answer is no. Like, hydrogen is actually a pretty mature sector with a lot of players existing. That's not saying that we're not seeing a dramatic push for innovation. We also do see a lot of startups emerging in different verticals within hydrogen, covering production, storage, midstream, as well as utilization of hydrogen. So this is a chart put together by the Clean Tech Group with a lot of great companies, players in the current space, both pure play as well as companies like major oil and gas companies that have a hydrogen presence. If anybody is interested, I'm happy to share these slides. I saw a question from the audience. I think this is the last next, or just to check. Great. So that's where we are today related to hydrogen. And to help kick off the panel, I'm going to have one question for each of the speakers in order for them to introduce who they are, what their company is doing a little bit more. The first question is for Don. So Plug Power has really been a leader in the hydrogen fuel cell space for nearly 2 decades now, and you've been with the company for over 10 years in various different roles. Over that period of time, we're curious, how do you see the sectors matured? Are people viewing the fuel cell and hydrogen business differently? And how has Plug's mission and business model evolved during that period as well?
Thanks for the question, Lydia, and thanks again for everyone at YPE for setting this up and inviting me here to speak. It's a really exciting time, not just here at Plug Power, but really for anyone in the hydrogen space. As you mentioned, I've been at Plug Power for 10 years, and it's been a pretty wild ride. Had our ups and our downs, but we've been pretty relentless in our journey, and the sector's matured a lot. I'd say the customers that we talk with and the conversations we have, are exciting, right? We're talking much bigger scale than we ever have before. They're numerous. We've got a lot more customers that we're talking with than we really ever have before, and they're diverse. So we're talking different parts of the world, different applications, many different timeframes. We used to talk about single projects or even pilot projects. Now we're talking about multi-year expansions, right? 10, 20-year long programs. I mean, we got our start as an R&D company, right? Figuring out how to make a fuel cell work. How much temperature can we get out of them? How many buildings can we power? What's the right application? And the commercial market for fuel cells out here. And we chose material handling because it had a clear value proposition. Didn't rely on subsidies. The subsidies help, but there've been a clear value proposition for a typical distribution center. For a Walmart or Amazon, we save them probably about $1 million a year in value. And so, you know, our mission and business model, I wouldn't say it's evolved as much, because I think our priority has always been to just help the customer in any way we can. So like I said, we started off with being just a fuel cell manufacturing company, being an integration company. But back in 2014, we expanded into hydrogen refueling stations. So we make the fuel cells that go into the forklift truck or the delivery van or the big rig truck or the mining equipment. Anything that has a diesel engine or can be powered by a battery can be powered by a fuel cell. And we make the hydrogen refueling station that actually dispenses the hydrogen, that stores the hydrogen, that compresses the hydrogen. And we also make the fuel. We make electrolyzers. We have our own IP, our own manufacturing process. We are the world's first multi-gigawatt PEM fuel cell and PEM electrolyzer manufacturer. So we have a large footprint we are 100% vertically integrated in that we make the fuel, we can deliver the fuel, we make the refueling station, and we make the fuel cell that consumes it. So we have a closed ecosystem. So if anybody wants to bring hydrogen and fuel cells online, that's what we can do. And so I think advancing our capabilities and broadening our scope is kind of how we've evolved. And I'd say it's always just been at the forefront of trying to be the best partner we can. In the beginning, it wasn't that easy to use hydrogen. You'd have to go to multiple types of vendors. You'd have to go to an EPC firm. You'd have to go to a delivery company. You'd have to go to a generating company. And now I think the rest of the market is really seeing that. You're seeing lots of vertical integration as folks are trying to cut cost out, become a leader in their own space, their own geographic or their own market. And so, you know, the public perceptions towards hydrogen have changed because it's becoming a lot simpler. And when you make something much simpler, it happens to expand at a faster rate. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of interest from existing customers that want to expand because we've been able to make it easy and we've been able to make it cleaner. We've acquired a company called Giner ELX and a company called United Hydrogen last year for a little north of $100 million. And we now have green hydrogen capabilities. And so we're making a network of about 500 tons of daily capacity here in the United States. And so fueling big rigs, injecting gas, hydrogen, green hydrogen made from solar and wind and hydro into the natural gas distribution system or directly into gas turbines. Those are the types of conversations we're having now. So customers are expanding what they want to talk about, what they want to look at. And new customers, new markets that really don't understand hydrogen, but it's taken us 20 years to make the conversation simple. But now that we've done it, we're just getting a lot of interest in a lot of different ways.
Thanks, Doug. Congrats for making it so far. So for Andrew, my question is, you have really broad experience in the hydrogen sector, previously focused on policy and other aspects, and now with BayoTech. And so the question is, based on where we are today, whether you call it the hype or the significant increase in interest in hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, do you think that's mainly driven by technology advancement over the past couple of years or government policies and incentives or do you think there really is an increase in customer demand for us to get there?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, we take those questions maybe one at a time, right? So I think that absolutely yes, the answer is there's a very noticeable and significant increase in interest and investment in hydrogen, as a primary component in the energy transition and pathway. I think hydrogen in general is grabbing attention because it's particularly versatile as a energy carrier and a zero carbon fuel at the point of consumption. And because of potential for utilization in long-term energy storage and generation applications, it has a variety of different end-use applications that make it particularly appealing. And I think clean hydrogen technologies undoubtedly are leading the way. That I think it's fair to say that's a result of some of the significant decreases in costs and price around clean hydrogen products in recent years. I think there's still a long way to go and some production pathways for clean hydrogen in terms of price, but I think it's probably hard to think of another market segment in the energy sector that's seeing the kind of interest and investment, well, certainly the amount of interest that the hydrogen sector is today. I think as for the second question, I'm going to punt here and say it's all a combination of all three of the things you've mentioned, right? So again, take it maybe one at a time. Advancements in technology are rapid on both the supply and generation side, as well as the demand and end use side. I think you're seeing significantly more end users particularly in the heavy duty vehicle sector in commercial transportation, where I think hydrogen and fuel cell technologies, as you mentioned, offer a particularly strong alternative where batteries have some limitations. I think Val's sector is a uniquely fascinating one, right? So, and I'm sure he would tell you that trying to build an aviation propulsion system that will get a regional passenger jet to move even a moderate distance at any sort of a normal comparable speed and performance that you see in modern aircraft using battery as a platform, I think is a kind of a spruce goose situation in the end, right? So I think that's I think the advancements in the tech are probably one of the key drivers. Government policy, I think that's huge, but it's regional and it's uneven, right? If you look at the EU, which I think it's fair to say led the charge, pretty much every EU country has its own national hydrogen strategy, and I think that's a significant driver. The US, a little slow to the game there, does not yet have a national hydrogen strategy, but I think as we'll probably talk about later, the federal government is catching up. And I think we're also seeing the states tackling this and providing policies and initiatives for investment and development of hydrogen infrastructure and hydrogen markets. They're doing that individually. And I think that's also causing significant investment and increased interest. And then I think, lastly, I mean, customer demand is definitely related to the advancements in technology as efficiency, performance, and efficiency and performance go up and are improving. I think and costs are simultaneously declining. I think customer demand is growing. I think it's pretty rapid. So all three of those things taken together make for a pretty significant increase in interest.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. Next question for Val is, since Andrew mentioned you're in a sector that is uniquely exciting, we're curious, how did you make the decision to focus on aviation, and what do you think the key challenges are, and why hydrogen is in a good position to help you solve that decarbonization problem within that sector? And maybe looking beyond in the next 5-10 years, in the ideal scenario of where the company is heading towards, what do you think are the big drivers and where we'll be in that time frame?
Thanks, Lydia, and thanks, Andrew, for the plug there. That's a good segue. So yeah, the reason we're in aviation is because we believe that this is the next sustainability frontier in transportation. So by now, you can see what's happening in the ground mobility space. Obviously, the latest round of development kickstarted by Tesla back 12, 13 years ago, and then picked up by a lot of other manufacturers. Although I'm still amazed how slow the rest of the group is. All the traditional automakers are still catching up and still cannot catch up, and this is actually pretty fascinating to watch. I think sort of a similar play will work in the aerospace as well. So there are established manufacturers of engines, established manufacturers of aircraft, and they will not be the ones who will bring the true innovation to the space. We at ZeroAvia, by this time, we're in a lot of forums at very high level, and we see only confirmation of that. So we believe that aviation is the next frontier for sustainability. The solution will not be brought by the incumbents, so we need to work on it. The personal side of it, I'm a private pilot, so rotorcraft for helicopters and airplanes, and there's a personal connection to the industry, and I don't want my industry to be blamed for ever growing impact on climate. And aviation is going there. It is, as we call, flying into its own sustainability crisis. It's actually quite sizable industry, about $1.5 trillion right before the pandemic. The size similar to worldwide automotive or worldwide energy industry. And it doesn't really have a good solution for decarbonization today. And it's not just about decarbonization. This industry is relatively unique among others in that the emissions occur at high altitudes, which means that the climate impact from aviation is less than half caused by CO2, but over half of the total impact, or in other words, at least the same amount of climate impact is caused by non-CO2 factors because of high altitude emissions of particulates, of nitrogen oxide, high temperature water vapor that you cannot do anything with, emitted at 40,000 feet, and that causes a lot of additional climate impact. So things that might work for ground transportation, like synthetic fuel, for instance, right? That is also hydrogen derived, of course, but synthetic jet fuel, they at best can address only 50% of the problem. And as we go forwards, the problem becomes bigger and bigger because aviation also now we have pandemic and still aviation is a little bit depressed, but historically pre-pandemic and post-pandemic markets, aviation is one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing transportation sector. And as the quality of life improves worldwide, people just more and more, hundreds of millions, billions of new passengers come online, and everybody wants to get in the air because that's the most convenient way to move from point A to point B, distant point B, at speed. So we're going to see further growth. And those two things combined basically say, hey, you really need to figure out how to solve it. One other factor there is that the lifetime of a vehicle in aviation is about 3 times longer than lifetime of a vehicle in automotive. It's about 30 years versus 10 years or 11 years, I think, in the United States for a ground vehicle. So you have this big problem. It's getting bigger. There is no solution. The vehicle lifetime is longer. About 30 years, which is just incidentally the time between now and 2050 when all the governments and everybody wants to be zero emission, net zero climate impact. So you see the sort of perfect storm for a real solution to happen, and that's what we wanted to do. And if you look at the fundamentals, the physics of it, just the amount of energy and amount of power that you need in order to bring any kind of significant size commercial aircraft up in the air and go the significant amount of distance, you will see that the batteries won't work. The hybrid solution don't make any sense because you're only going to be addressing maybe 5-10% reduction, and you're only delaying the inevitable by 3-4 years, and then you're back to square one. So you really need a fundamentally zero climate impact solution. And with a hydrogen fuel cell specifically is such solution, because not only hydrogen is zero carbon emission fuel, and if you do it in produce it in a renewable way, then zero carbon the entire chain. But also with the fuel cells being a low temperature catalytic reaction and electrified powertrain, you don't have any emissions of other climate forcing agents. And you do have the water vapor emissions, but with, again, low temperature reaction or powertrain that you have with a hydrogen electric solution, you can manage that output as well. So it really is the only thing that can credibly, from first principles and physics perspective, can solve the entirety of the problem. And that's why we started it. That's why we focused on that. And over the next 20-30 years, we expect our solutions and perhaps our competitors' solutions of similar type to win over the commercial aviation space. ZeroAvia itself, we are going to have our first commercial offering on the market in about 3 years, 2024. You'll be able to buy a ticket to on a 20-seat aircraft, which is a lot of these are flying, especially in Europe, regional, sub-regional routes. Again, we built engines for that, so we have those in testing now. We're going to fly a 20-seater on our hydrogen electric powertrain later this year. We have already flown a number of smaller prototypes, manned vehicles, 6-seat vehicles. So now we're going to fly a 20-seater. It's going to be in commercial by 2024. Then we're putting in the 70-seat aircraft into commercial service with our engines in 2026, and 2030, hopefully a single aisle, sort of a smaller A320, A220 type airframes, or Boeing 737 smaller versions, so 10 years out, and then beyond that. So really, this type of approach is the one that can scale to any size of the vehicle, and with some modifications of the vehicles themselves, or perhaps new vehicles, it can get the range similar to fossil fuel as well.
Sounds amazing. I will hop on that hydrogen aircraft. For the next 20 minutes, I think we're going to have more of a free discussion. I have some questions prepared, and then we can move on to questions from the audience as well. The first question I have is, when people think about zero emission vehicles and clean transportation, inevitably we're comparing battery electric vehicles against fuel cell vehicles. They all have their different disadvantages or advantages, areas that they are more applicable in versus not. So I'm just curious if any of you could help us better understand the comparison between these two in terms of energy density, cost of production, cost of running it, maybe also the environmental impact between those two, and where we see how they both play a role in decarbonizing transportation.
I can start, Lydia. So, we always view transportation or anything mobile as, we view fuel cell applications as an and solution. So it's fuel cells and batteries together can tackle all of the different applications there are. So whether you think the car you drive, whether it's a 4-door sedan or a coupe or an SUV or whatever it is, all the way up to planes, trains, automobiles, think of heavier applications. Think of long travel distances, big rig tractors, high payload requirements, anything that has a penalty for a downtime, so a robo taxi or an Uber, anything that has needs a lot of energy to stay up and running, like a forklift truck, or there's a high penalty for downtime. That's where fuel cell applications can make a lot of sense. In material handling specifically, 70% of the cost to run that distribution center is labor. And when you have 3 to 5% of your day spent changing batteries, because a forklift truck in 1 year will actually have more hours used than a car will in its lifetime. These industrial trucks will operate 3,000-4,000 hours a year. And for those autonomous or automated guided vehicles, which we all know that we're all excited for the autonomous vehicle to come into the over the road transportation space, but there already exists in the industrial space. And so those vehicles can actually operate 7,000 or more hours a year. And so those high efficient, highly utilized assets that have a lot of payload requirements, and they actually make a lot of money, or they have a lot of opportunity costs to be down, that's really where a fuel cell can make a lot of sense. Where you have a regular car that maybe is used 2 or 3% of the year, and you have a lot of downtime that can charge, and you don't need to pay for that infrastructure for fast charging, that's where a pure BEV can make sense. And then there's some business cases in between where there's short distances or medium distances with high payloads, and there's a lot of unique circumstances. But I think, forklift trucks, big rig tractors, airplanes, I think some of those applications are really the most clear-cut examples of where a fuel cell makes sense, just because we all understand how big an airplane works, and maybe some of us understand how lift works, but it's I think that's the clear-cut example of why fuel cells will make a lot of sense. They're just in general a lighter powertrain, a lighter fuel source, and they're very dense from a power perspective, whereas batteries are effectively a bit more linear. The more energy you need to store on board, the heavier they get. And we actually have a symposium every year, and our next one will be in about a month. So I recommend everyone, if you want to learn more about Plug Power and our hydrogen applications, we have a symposium that's open to the public. There's a link on our website. And you can learn a lot more about all the different applications that we have and where they make a lot of sense. But in a previous symposium, we had DHL, the world's largest, if not number one, then probably number two distribution company in the world, give a very good presentation on why they were looking at fuel cells very heavily and investing in it. And it's because to meet their average delivery range with the amount of cargo they carry on board, in order to make that work with a pure battery electric delivery van, they would have needed to take up the entire cargo space with just batteries. And they kind of made the joke that they're in the business of delivering packages, not batteries. And so when they can retrofit that vehicle with a lightweight, very dense powertrain or a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, they're able to get, I think, 85 or 90% of the original cargo space. And I think that's what today's fuel cell and hydrogen technologies, as we advance and become a bit thinner, a bit more robust, and have a bigger supply chain behind the entire industry, I think we'll be able to meet, if not exceed, previous payloads.
Got it. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the comprehensive introduction of that. And as a follow-up question to Don's answer, maybe this is also a question for Val and Andrew. We experience the chicken and egg issue a lot in the transportation space, where you have to deploy a vehicle at a certain scale and utilization rate to persuade people to build infrastructure that actually supports the vehicle. So that's the problem in EV charging. That's also the problem in hydrogen and fuel cell vehicles. From your perspective in different parts of the value chain, where do you see the problem is with the infrastructure build out, and what the potential solution could be?
No, so maybe let me take that initially, and then Andrew can advise us of the solution to the problem. So from our perspective, and I'm sort of bleed into your previous question as well, or the main question. The way we looked at it off the battery versus hydrogen, and the answer was relatively easy for aviation, but we built a framework around this, which basically said you look at utilization of assets and the energy intensity of assets that you're repowering, right? And you start with fossil fuel, for example, and you look at utilization is, and Don mentioned some of those things, right? Is how many hours per day you have the asset actually moving and delivering value and consuming power, right? So that's one dimension. The second dimension is intensity, and we like to approximate that with, if you take the fossil fuel variant of that asset, of that transport, what percentage of its total mass is fuel, right? And that gives you an idea of energy intensity. So if you take all types of transportation and sort of put them on that map, you will have the personal car is the absolute worst, okay? And the commercial aircraft is the absolute best on that. Well, rockets maybe not so great on the utilization. The commercial aircraft, 14 hours a day. In the 737 MAX, you have 40% of the fuel, 40% of the total takeoff mass is fuel, right? So it's extreme energy intensity, great utilization. Then you have heavy duty trucks, pretty much same utilization, but lower energy intensity. And then you walk down that sort of staircase. So with that, it gets pretty clear that, you know, aviation, the only answer is really something like hydrogen. And moreover, we turn that argument around as saying, with that much going for hydrogen in aviation versus other sectors, and the reality of this fueling infrastructure problem being much simpler actually in aviation, because you have only a very small number of locations where you need to deliver fuel, because you can't, you know, in a truck you can show up everywhere, in a car you can show up everywhere, and people, you know, in personal vehicles demand refueling everywhere, which is a very hard problem. In aviation, you can't show up everywhere. You show up in a commercial airport. In the US, 450 locations cover actually 100% of all commercial traffic. 150 locations cover 97% of commercial traffic in aviation. So that's your infrastructure problem. You can build, like somebody like Shell, who's one of our investors and strategic partner on the fueling side, somebody like Shell can build 150 locations. You know, it's a tractable problem. It's a very different problem to consumer vehicles, the cars that you drive that have a benefit of having 100,000 plus refueling stations in the United States, right? The gas stations. So if you look at things from these first principles, it's pretty clear that, you know, aviation is the only thing that will work. It's also way easier on the infrastructure side in terms of the problem than for some of the ground transport situations. And we also looked at it from that perspective, but I'm sure Andrew and BayoTech have some additional answers there.
We certainly like to think so, Val. Yeah, no, I mean, I think Val and Don have covered a lot of the themes when this you know, this question is not an uncommon one. And you know, if you're comparing BEV infrastructure as well, maybe take a step back, right? So on the hydrogen side, you know, I do think that's you know, given the fact that the commercial fleet operators and heavy duty transport operators are likely and almost certainly the first movers in the fuel cell mobility space. I mean, they are the ones who will be investing in these dispensing stations and fueling infrastructure. So it's not, as Val said, it's not going to be the same type of infrastructure. It's a fleet infrastructure. It's owned and operated by a private user, right? And for the fuel cell space and for the hydrogen space, that means that this kind of infrastructure needs to be purchased and managed by a single company or a group of companies, or a single entity that's investing in it. So it becomes an interesting question around how do what's the best solution then, right? If you're a fleet operator, and we're looking at this sort of downtime and operational demands that both Don and Val have identified, then you have to figure out whether or not you can meet that extensive infrastructure investment for battery fleet versus a fuel cell fleet. So we think that for the commercial fleet operators, putting cheaply hydrogen generation systems and allowing them to scale from small initial operations up to larger and larger operations, and it allows them to function faster and meet the demand and commercial demands that they have on their fleets. We think that's the way to go, and that's sort of, if I can very quickly, see if I can do this, I'll show you how we, I can't share my screen, can I?
I don't think we're set up that way. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Well, I had a slide showing how we scale that up, right? But you can, offer different refueling and dispensing solutions depending on the demands of the client. And, with hydrogen, that can be scaled cost effectively. And I think as you do that with a battery charging infrastructure for a single user, it becomes more and more cost prohibitive as you scale up that infrastructure. And with hydrogen, the curve is downward, right? So I think you will see that the private fleet operators will drive that forward when it comes to hydrogen fueling infrastructure.
Yeah, and just another quick note to add, I think in the state of California, across all of the different parts of the business chain, it's impactful, which is the LCFS incentives. And as an investor, we've been looking at refueling stations as well as charging stations because LCFS has a particular incentive that basically grants similar level of credits for the unused capacity of the refueling station / charger as the used component of it for a certain number of years to compensate for the upfront cost of building infrastructure. So that's just another way to help solve the chicken and egg issue. It's not completely covering it, but at least a starting place for people to consider putting in the money to build infrastructure before utilization rate is very high. And the next group of questions is more related to the production of hydrogen, because obviously we do need to produce hydrogen in order to use them in transportation. When we consider production of hydrogen today, a vast majority of hydrogen facilities are centralized. You produce at large scale and then distribute to various different places. And we are moving towards a model where some of that production will become more decentralized on-site at smaller volume, but that saves the transportation storage cost of hydrogen. So question for this review would be, how do you see the difference between the two, and how do we transition from where we are today to where we'd like to be in the future?
Yeah, sure. I'll tackle that one first. So, I mean, I think the answer could be quite long, but I think the value proposition of being able to put hydrogen generation on site and in a modular and distributed capacity is multifold, right? So I think one of the first ones that we would point out is that not just is compression and transportation of hydrogen from centralized facilities extremely costly, particularly the compression side of things, but it is also one of the components that add to the emissions and the carbon intensity of a hydrogen product or of any product, right, of any fuel that's being transported. So by eliminating that or greatly reducing the transportation component, the long distance transportation component, as well as the compression component, you're not just reducing cost, you're also reducing the emissions profile associated with that product. So that we think is the, the dual proposition. In addition to that, the distributed and modular structure, as I mentioned in the, the last question, it allows you to scale, and it allows the end user to scale their production capacity commensurate with the demand and needs of their fleet. Or you can even, we are also investing heavily in what we're calling, not surprisingly, biogas hydrogen hubs, right? Which are local facilities. Actually, sort of that background behind me is the mock-up of what ours will look like. So the hydrogen generator and reformer is inside of that fencing. So, but that would be open to initially private off-takers, local fleet operators using fuel cell trucks. But as we scale and as hydrogen infrastructure and hydrogen vehicles become more common, that would be something that would become available to public private drivers and just like a standard gas station. But I think that proposition for the distributed and modular production system is mostly focused on the fact that you can scale these things commensurate with your need. You can you eliminate the transportation emissions associated with you eliminate the emissions associated with transportation from centralized hydrogen facilities, and it also obviously allows you to reduce costs associated with compression, depending on what your offtake and end use application is, right? So I think those are the big advantages, and I think that we will continue to see that as more and more companies invest in the hydrogen space. We'll see that those types of models will scale very nicely.
Yeah, we're and at ZeroAvia, we're very excited about distributed production, and again, for the air use, the commercial aviation use, the scales you achieve with any kind of commercial utilization, aircraft moving around, so you achieve multiple tons a day per location very, very quickly, which bodes well for distributed production. So that's quite exciting. One other thing that we see in the distributed production is also resilience of networks. If you, those of you who actually, drive hydrogen vehicles, well, in the United States, mostly in California, you will know that most of the fuel infrastructure problems are due to central plant production problems. And this really highlights the vulnerability of the centralized model. You have any problem with your centralized production and you're in trouble. And the distributed system allows you to have a much more resilient network across the board. This really, as we depend more and more on this fuel in a variety of ways, this will become more and more critical aspect.
Yeah, I agree with everything my panelists have said. I think when we look at the cost of hydrogen for anyone, it really starts with what does the customer need? What is the purity they need? What is the pressure they need? And what is the volume they require? There are certain applications where delivery just doesn't make any sense, right? If you're talking tens of thousands of tons of on-site hydrogen production, you can't really deliver that unless it's via a very large pipeline. And so if you think of, delivery, pipelines can be, if they're very big and used by a lot of people, they can cost as little as 15 to 20 cents. If they're private, they can cost maybe 50 to 80 cents per kilogram. If you think of delivering liquid hydrogen, you can deliver 3,000, 4,000 kilograms of liquid hydrogen in one truckload. And so that's a lot of hydrogen. When you're delivering gas, depending on the pressure, you're talking anywhere from 200, 300 kilos up to about 1,000 kilos with ultra high pressure, 7,000 PSI type hydrogen with, a maximum amount of space on board. And so when you think of delivering liquid hydrogen, it can be 50 cents or $1 per kilogram, depending on how far you want to go, because you can get a lot more volume on board. with gaseous hydrogen, you're probably talking $3 to $5, and that's delivering maybe 100 to 150 miles. And so, if you're trying to think about a nationwide network in the beginning of the commercialization, you're probably not going to have a distributed generation of the purity and pressure required for all these applications. And so it's one of the reasons why we focused on liquid hydrogen, because from an order from a customer, it takes us 16 weeks to build all the fuel cells and to build the infrastructure they need. It takes 2 years to bring a new plant online, to go through all of the permitting and construction. And so you need sort of that decentralized generation and distribution network to enable all the new applications to come online. If you try to build everything step by step, it's a bit more challenging, but not everyone needs delivered hydrogen. We have modular electrolyzer systems that we can install at a customer location, and you just buy your renewable electricity online. And so when you think about the cost of green hydrogen, really 60 to 70% of the cost of hydrogen is the electricity itself, right? It's not the delivery, it's not the assets that are depreciating, it's the cost of energy. And so that's projected to come down as it has over the past 10 years, as well as the next 10 years. So solar PPAs 10 years ago were in the 16 to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Today, even recently, we saw announcements out of Chile for 1.4 cents per kilowatt hour. That is an amazing transformation. And so over the next 10 years, we're expecting costs to continue to go down. And so, I think the costs of green hydrogen are just going to continue to come down even further, to a point where not only can they compete with gray or blue hydrogen, but most likely will end up winning in the long run.
Awesome, that is very helpful. Yeah, and since you already touched upon the cost of hydrogen and how that's changing, I think people from the audience are probably curious, especially related to green hydrogen. What are the main drivers of the cost of producing green hydrogen today? Obviously, there's the equipment and power, and we always have the dream of using curtailed renewable energy to produce green hydrogen, and as if we don't actually have to pay for that electricity. But is that something that's realistic, or how do you consider the different components that drive the end cost of green hydrogen? I don't know if this is a question for Don or Andrew, but any perspective would be very appreciated.
I can start, and Andrew, you can chime in if that helps. Yeah, I'd say we've looked a lot at how do you use curtailed electricity. And so if you have a 300, 500 megawatt wind or solar farm, and they come to you and say, 3 to 5% of our total output gets curtailed, you start thinking about it like, wow, that could really pencil out over a year. But when you look at the data, those curtailments don't happen of 3% every day over the course of a year. They happen to all 500 megawatts for about 5 minutes a day at random periods of time. And so the amount of investment that you need in order to utilize all 500 megawatts for 5 minutes or an hour or 3 hours is just, anybody that works at an electric utility company or any sort of peaky system, you pay a lot for that peak capability. And so to be able to utilize that can be pretty expensive today. I mean, as if you read any of the research reports from Bloomberg or anything that we produce, you'll see that, we're anticipating costs of the systems to come down, 60, 70, 80% within the next 10 years. And so I think in the future, it's going to be possible to start using it at a much higher scale, but just given the nature of why renewable energy is curtailed and how it's curtailed, it's a bit difficult to actually make it work right now. But I think, our core strategy is the co-location of our electrolyzer system with solar and with wind, so we can avoid the grid and we can leverage the entire output of those solar and wind plants. And so PEM electrolyzers have millisecond ramp rates, and so you can follow the output of solar and you can follow the output of wind And certain other technologies may take, several hours to either heat up or to just get to the right temperatures and pressures for their processing systems to work. Whereas our system can ramp up and down within milliseconds to the tune of 90% increases and decreases in load. But there's each technology has a bit of a different good and bad attributes. So where we're can be more easily scaled with solar and wind, it's there's other applications that can be suitable for different technologies.
Yeah, I mean, from the electrolytic side of the green hydrogen equation, I mean, I would say that Don's pretty well covered it, right? I mean, I think
maybe Andrew, you can also just talk about the gray hydrogen or blue hydrogen and how that compares to where we are today. And obviously blue hydrogen will be a little bit more expensive, but where do you see cost parity in the future, or because potential carbon pricing, how that would impact the equation?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, as you summarized at the beginning, I mean, today, what is it, 97%, 98% of the world's hydrogen supply is gray, created by centralized SMR facilities, and the vast majority, again, I think it's in the 90 percentile range of the offtake and end users are in the refining sector, right? So and they are also the generators of it as well, right? So they're both the generators and the end users. And I think, that is actually pretty cheap hydrogen, right? For a number of reasons, but created at a centralized SMR facility, it's very cheap and it's particularly dirty. And if it has to be transported anywhere, it doesn't get any better, right? So I think blue hydrogen and carbon capture technology is early stage. It is obviously more expensive than gray. I suspect that over the coming years, that Don is probably has the right intuition that costs between blue and electrolytic hydrogen are going to equalize pretty quickly. Depending on what for electrolytic hydrogen, there's the challenge that it is a very clean source if it is indeed powered by purely renewable energy. As something I think Don was probably touching on, but a lot of places you're not going to be able to run an electrolyzer 24 hours a day, so it has to be either connected to a grid or a non-intermittent power source, right? So it has its own challenges. I think some of the price drivers, again, as Don touched on, for electrolytic hydrogen in the past few years were largely in a significant way driven by CapEx costs, right? And now those CapEx costs, agreed, are coming down very fast, which is encouraging. And now OpEx costs are driving a lot of these issues for electrolytic hydrogen. And I think it just like your end use or your fuel source at an end use your end use is going to determine which platform you want to use. Similarly, your locality, your region, the demands for generation, or the resources you have for generation are going to determine what is the best and cleanest hydrogen source at the best cost, right? So that would be, I'm tying that back there because for instance, BayoTech, our reformers can use renewable natural gas from landfills or dairy farms. That under the CARB model actually has a negative carbon intensity because you're using methane, which is obviously a significantly worse greenhouse gas than CO2. So, if we use renewable natural gas in our reformers, we can actually go carbon negative, where an electrolyzer can only go to zero, right? Because it can just use renewable energy. So, we would say that that is another point where, depending on what your resources available to generate the hydrogen are, there may be, that will dictate what's the best and most cost-effective hydrogen source.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And from there, we want to also talk about some other players outside of manufacturing or technical expertise. We definitely need the help from government and private sector investors, as well as corporates, to also be engaged in order to create ecosystem for deployment and production of hydrogen. So from that perspective, my first question is, this is also integrated with some questions from the audience. Where in the federal infrastructure bill or other federal incentive programs do you see new grants or other funding coming for hydrogen and fuel cells related projects? On the tax incentive side, as well as upfront grant, what type of incentives or infrastructure build out supported by the government can be helpful in order for all of us to get where we need faster?
I'd like to say, at least from Plug Power's perspective, I mean, the government and policymakers have really done a great job. They've helped out the industry pretty significantly over the years, whether it be the extension of the investment tax credit a few years ago, even though it lapsed, that was quickly rectified within a year. The old 1603 grant programs, when there wasn't really any tax appetite. And all these other programs that have been around over the years for one-off projects and funding to help. And so, there's currently bills out there for production tax credits that could be upwards of $3 a kilogram for hydrogen generation that meets specific carbon intensities. And talking about colors, green, gray, blue, pink, white, it always comes down to an actual quantification of carbon intensity. So, some amount of grams per molecule or kilograms or megajoules, there's always a quantification element. And so depending on what methodology you use, whether it's an Argonne National Labs, or if it's an LCFS program, or if there's some other methodology that's employed, that can change the actual carbon intensity from a quantifiable standpoint. But that's kind of the role of industry, right? To figure out what's the right way to do it. And the role of the government, I think, is to help get it started. And so I think in the most recent infrastructure package, there was an announcement of about $8 billion of funding for up to, I think it was 4 or 5 large energy infrastructure, hydrogen hubs specifically, that, one of each type, right? It's going to be carbon capture and sequestration, which I think, has a role. It's going to be very important because we have a large infrastructure of hydrogen generation that in the US, and I think globally, is about 95 to 97% natural gas feedstocks. And so, there are emissions associated with that. And those are 20, 30, 40-year assets that aren't going away. So, existing gray, I think, will become blue over time, or substitute renewable natural gas feedstocks. And then mostly the growth will come with green. But I just like to say, I think the government's done a pretty good job of giving the support, at least from our perspective, where some of the support has been needed over time.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Don's take there. I mean, I think the federal government is catching up now on hydrogen policy and incentives, investment incentives, or I think I'm sure Don could probably correct me on this. I think there are 3 or 4 hydrogen production tax credit bills currently being considered in Congress. I think the most recent one is likely to move under the infrastructure bill. But yeah, it's gaining enough interest from federal legislators that there are multiple bills offering production tax credits, investment tax credits, There's the regional clean hydrogen hubs that Don pointed to in the infrastructure bill. There are a number of different structured incentives at the federal level that I think have the potential to be particularly effective, especially at the moment. Some of the legislation has some interesting tiering structure, which as Don was talking about, carbon intensity is really the best way to measure the cleanliness of hydrogen, if you want to call it that. But if you put that on a sliding scale and you offer producers $3 per kilogram for clean, very low carbon intensity hydrogen, it will make a significant difference in the cost to the end user and the customer, right? So I think they're doing a good job at coming up with some structures and initiatives that have potentially significant effect on making this an affordable and attractive sector to invest in.
We should have somebody from the government on the panel today, otherwise they're missing all the compliments that they're receiving from the industry. And to complement with what the government solution is, obviously the role of private investors and corporates are also pretty important. As Val mentioned, Shell is a strategic investor in the company, and they're also helping to potentially build out infrastructure that support deployment of hydrogen aviation. So I'm just curious, for companies like Shell or other corporates that have mandates or goals to venture into the hydrogen space, where do you see the areas that they can play and the most value added investments they can make?
Well, I think thanks for the lead in there, Lydia. From our perspective, we have a couple of large strategics that are engaged with us. So Shell, you mentioned, and in general, energy companies have a lot to benefit from in this transformation, whether it's the traditional fuel companies like Shell or utilities like Enel, for example. And we have just done in the UK, we've just done a partnership with Octopus Energy that's pretty innovative on the zero emission space and hydrogen production space. So they're going to be building part of our infrastructure as well. I think energy companies, maybe some of the companies with end users that would benefit from hydrogen revolution. And already, Don talked about Amazon, for example, or the warehouse space and material handling. Amazon is a huge customer there. Amazon is also one of our investors from their climate pledge funds, and we're looking forward to working with them as a customer on air transportation of goods as well. So the companies like that, like large corporates like FedEx, UPS, have a lot to gain from hydrogen as end users in their ESG goals. So that's another vector, and that's all in addition to, of course, we think, and our financial investors think, that this is a huge potential return financially, these opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's been some announcements and studies done by McKinsey and all sorts of really smart consulting firms that have estimated, that by 2050, right, in order to get to a point where they see feasible, which is hydrogen being somewhere between 10 and 20% of the world's energy consumption, can take any, north of $11 trillion of investment, right? So energy transitions take a long time. They're not new, right? They take anywhere from 20, 30, 50 years. If you look back to our past, not that long ago, we didn't have electricity, right? As far as, time horizons are concerned. And so it takes a while to build out the infrastructure, but it happens quicker than you would think. So, I think the $8 billion proposal that's in the current infrastructure plans and some of the pledges that we're seeing in Europe with the IPCEI projects and the Fit for 55 and all of these big policies that are out there, it's a start, right? It's some funding to help get the ecosystem up and running, get the supply chain up and running, get customers interested and experiencing over that initial adoption curve hump. But it's going to be up to these private companies or public companies, right? Like Amazon, Google, Microsoft. I mean, these guys are already making huge investments in solar and wind and have driven the corporate PPA markets pretty significantly to record levels. And so, what happened to solar and wind with production tax credits and investment tax credits and how that industry came online and drove down costs through manufacturing and scale, the same thing's going to happen in hydrogen. It's just, we're just at the very beginning, and we're at the beginning of that J curve of adoption.
Yeah, awesome. I tried to incorporate a lot of the questions from the audience already into the list. And one thing that we haven't touched upon from the audience is to address safety concerns as relate to production and usage of hydrogen. I think for people who are in the industry, maybe safety is not as big of a concern. But I think from the outside world, there's always all these news about, oh, something exploded and it must be because of hydrogen. And so can we talk about how do you think about safety, and what are the different things that the industry from a technology or equipment perspective or operational perspective are doing in order to make sure that safety is not causing issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some academics out there that do a phenomenal job. I think Jack Brower has put out some very good public information and public speeches. So if you Google him and search for hydrogen safety videos, he goes through some phenomenal discussions and walks through the Hindenburg and comparing, which is not really caused by necessarily hydrogen. It was a static electric fire. And most of the smoke and inhalation was caused by the materials used covering the walls. And so even though hydrogen was involved, those types of engineering mishaps, they just don't happen nowadays. And even if you look at lithium-ion batteries, right, you can't bring them on airplanes anymore. And if you look at some of the recent announcements and fires from Tesla battery packs, these things happen, right, at any scale. You've had large explosions in oil and gas. You've had very tremendous amounts. But as far as safety is concerned, right, I mean, that's one of the top priorities everywhere in everyone's mind. And so managing pressure, managing temperatures, measuring with all of the dispensers where you can actually monitor and sniff out hydrogen, right? You have hydrogen detection everywhere, where if there is a leak, because it is very small and it's a pesky little molecule to try to manage, it's going to find its way out. But we have temperature, pressure, safety monitors. We have pressure relief valves everywhere. And so I think safety is always at the front of everyone's mind. I mean, everyone wants to go to work, do their job, and come home safe. And no one ever wants to be the reason that doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And aviation, of course, is a significant safety culture and safety certification process. And we've been working with the FAA and CAA, Civil Aviation Authority in the UK, for quite a bit. There is general sort of belief in the professional community in aviation that hydrogen can be made as safe or safer than jet fuel. And there are some pretty strong properties of hydrogen that make it quite realistic to have that kind of claim. So ignition temperatures are higher, radiative heat from the flame is lower. The dissipation is much faster. It doesn't pool, right? Like jet fuel, a typical dangerous situation for an aircraft on hard landing and hot brakes, liquid fuel leak to catching fire, and that actually happened in Moscow a couple of years ago, and it was pretty tragic. That is just not possible with something like hydrogen, especially if you take the location of your fuel tanks seriously, and manage the sort of leakage profile properly. So there are a lot of safety benefits, and but like any high energy substance, it requires proper handling and proper safety process around it. But with the right process, it can be made even safer than jet fuel today.
Awesome. Thanks for that insight. One last question from the audience, which is related to water usage for producing hydrogen, whether that's going to be a concern. Instead of troubling our panelists with this question, I'm going to provide a piece of fun fact for the day, which is an average American golf course uses about 312,000 gallons of water per day. And in order to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen, you need 2.38 gallons of water, which means that with an average water needed per day for a golf course, you can actually produce 131 tons of hydrogen. So comparatively, I think we're not in such a disadvantaged position in terms of fighting for water in the middle of the desert. So, but yes, there's definitely the use of water. That's another component for the driver of green hydrogen. But technically, you also return the water back to the earth when you use the hydrogen in the fuel cell. So whole loop. And then before we end our panel, I'd like to do one lightning round of question where all 4 of us provide a very short answer to one question. And this one question is, what do you think is the one thing that either investors or policymakers tend to miss when they think about hydrogen in the overall hydrogen economy or transportation sector? I will start with myself. I think I'd like to say there are a lot of great tax incentives, including ITC for fuel cells and similar incentives for hydrogen production. But the problem is the policymakers don't really understand that tax equity is extremely hard to get. So it doesn't mean that there's a tax incentive you can actually utilize it. As an investor, Generate Capital actually spent about, I think, 2 years or maybe more than 2 years to try to put together the first tax equity facility that actually monetizes fuel cells and other hydrogen-related ITC. So from that perspective, I think the initial intent of providing the ITC incentive is great, but the execution of it and monetization of it is very difficult. That's one thing I'd like to mention people typically miss. And I'll pass it to maybe Andrew can start with what's the next thing.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that policymakers often miss, but I think the one that we struggle with the most, and maybe Don and Val and yourself, Lydia, feel differently about this in the hydrogen sector, but at least in when it comes to transportation, zero emission transportation policy making, I think that the most common thing that the legislation lacks to take into account, and a lot of policy fails to take into account, is that your best and optimal solution is dictated by your end use case, right? So oftentimes legislators and policymakers get focused on a particular solution for the transportation sector or for any other sector, but when it comes to the transportation sector, they get focused on a particular technology and oftentimes dive in headfirst with headline grabbing incentive plans and tax credits, but then neglect that there are other market segments for which that same technology may not be a good solution, right? And I think hydrogen provides a very good solution in the near term to lower emissions and eliminate emissions in heavy duty transportation. Then I think that that it needs to be recognized as a superior solution there.
Yeah, from our side, ZeroAvia is actually a relatively easy question because not a lot of people thought about aviation as a great high volume use of hydrogen. Before last year, actually, last year was pretty good for us in a way that Airbus came out and said, well, we looked at it and hydrogen is the future. And then the Clean Sky Aviation Community and the European Union said pretty much the same thing. And now you see more and more momentum. but the governments, especially in the US, given the prior administration, the governments lag, right? So that's where we put a lot of efforts on our sides to push the fact that aviation is a pretty good use case, and in fact nothing else will really work in aviation. So we better make sure, as we design the programs around hydrogen infrastructure, hydrogen mobility, we make sure that aviation is prominently represented, and at the very least is not excluded. There are programs out there in the federal lands today that do not have aviation as that at least specific use cases, and aviation is not one of them, which makes aviation excluded from those programs by language, and that's just a very counterproductive thing, and we're successfully fighting that, and more to come.
One thing I'll say before I answer the question is talent's important. And we're actually hiring a lot here at Plug Power. So if anyone's interested, I'm actually hiring somebody on my team. So, feel free to take a look at our careers section of our website. And, I have a market strategy analyst position open. So there's a lot of smart people out there. But I'll say, as I've looked at it over the years, and this will be more of a state policy comment, there's a lot of copy and paste, I think, that happens from previous bills or previous pieces of legislation. And so from a fuel cell perspective or a hydrogen perspective, I'll say these types of technologies offer a lot of benefits to the grid, but current energy efficiency or programs around that benefit the electric grid don't usually think of fuel cells as electric vehicles or fuel cells as a benefit to the grid. So at least in material handling, we can remove a 0.5 megawatt of load on the grid, which frees up capacity on the system by changing out lead acid batteries that are inefficient, that don't hold charge, that degrade over time. So they require more energy in the future. And so looking at the different states, fuel cells, because we're not tied to the grid, because we're not an efficient lighting or HVAC system, you generally don't qualify for any sort of energy efficiency, but there truly is a benefit to the ratepayer. And I will say sometimes, choosing a technology can have some unintended consequences, at least in the LCFS language. Looking at the EER standards, the energy efficient, economic energy ratios, and looking at EVs versus FCEVs, they're thought of as more efficient. And even though sometimes, at least in material handling, those batteries can degrade, and so you can actually have a less efficient system over time, you kind of get a runaway incentive where you're incented to use more energy and you're not really making a policy that drives towards a specific target and letting the market figure it out. So those are just two comments that I've seen over time.
Awesome. Well, that wraps our panel today. Thank you all three of you for all the insights. I've been on panels with all three of you, and every time I talk to you, I learned a lot more new information. And I hope all of our audience enjoyed the conversation today. Please feel free to contact any of us if you have any follow-up questions. I also posted the 4 links to our websites for all of the positions that we're hiring for. And I will kick back to May and Tim, and if you have any other information to cover from YPE. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Lydia. Excellent job facilitating the conversations. And also the wonderful panelists, Andrew, Val, and Don, for sharing all your experiences and really diverse perspective from a policy angle, technology. We cover economics, infrastructure perspective, and for hydrogen's role in transportation. We definitely thank you all of you to stay this late. We went a little bit over time. Really excited to see all of your questions coming through. And it's a great experience collaborating with YPE San Francisco chapter as well. Just a reminder, we'll be sending out a survey after the event. So please fill that out. We welcome any feedback and suggestions on topics you want to hear about next. And just a quick plug, YPE NYC, we're hosting our first in-person happy hour on the 21st September. So look for details. Hope to see you and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.